If you've been with us, we've been working through this powerful, short, but powerful letter as James exhorts us to put our steadfast faith in Christ amid the instability and chaos of the fallen world that we live in. And the subject he's bringing us to this morning is this aspect, this arena of our daily lives. There are a lot of things that could be said to be ruling our daily lives, factors that basically decide for us what we're going to do today. You can probably think of quite a few of them. My energy level, how much am I going to be able to get done today? Or my relationships, our responsibilities, the expectations that others have on us. Lots of things that can dictate what we do with our time, but there's perhaps no greater tyrant in our modern world than our day planner. That is what so often rules over what we do day in and day out. Most of us probably have some sort of day planner. It might be a calendar on your fridge. It might be a booklet you carry in your backpack. For most of us, it's probably some sort of app on our phone, right? Constantly dinging to remind you that you're late for the next thing that you're supposed to be doing. Even our children are taught how to use a planner to organize their homework and assignments as early as elementary school. Some of us have multiple planners. We've got one for home, we've got one for work, or these family planners where you can take every child's individual schedule along with mom and dad and merge them into one overwhelming digital web of expectation. And planning is not a bad thing. Planning is not a bad thing. There's some of you who are hoping after reading this passage that I'm going to say no more planning at all, because that's how you already live your lives, much to the anxiety of everyone around you. Planning is not so much the problem. There's wisdom in looking ahead. There's wisdom in preparing and executing. It's a good thing to know when that bill is due and be able to pay it on time. It's wise when you know someone is expecting something from you to be able to deliver that on time. Proverbs 21:5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." So it's not so much that planning is the problem. And it's not even technically so much that our planners rule over us. We have to ask a deeper question than that. Who is actually ruling our planner? Your planner only rules you once you've made the plans. So who is ruling your planner? Is it us? Is it our dreams and desires, our ambitions and agenda? Is it someone else, their expectations and requirements and plans for your life? And are we ultimately submitting all of that to the plan of the Lord? That's what James addresses in chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. Submit your plans to the will of God while continuing to do good. Submit your plans to the will of God while continuing to do good. And as we've been in this letter, we've seen James touch on all sorts of different topics. Testing and temptation, partiality, obedience, wisdom, speech, fighting and quarreling. And it can feel a little bit haphazard as he moves from subject to subject, but the thread that has tied all of these different subjects together throughout the book is this common danger of worldliness, of when the church allows the world to set the terms and categories and methods of how we go about our daily life. This temptation to divide our loyalties and affections between God and between the fallen world we live in. It's a problem he mentions throughout the book. We saw him develop it the most so far last week in chapter 4. Verse 4, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?" What is it that causes fights and quarrels and messes everything up? It's this worldliness that lurks within us. And yet those worldly desires that can cause so much damage among the people of God, they can not only derail the church by doing that sort of damage, but also by distracting us in our daily lives. So it's not always the fuel of fighting. Sometimes it's just the distraction from what truly matters or who I'm ultimately serving. That's what James focuses on here. This temptation for all of us to just get caught up in our own lives and plans as though we're the ones calling the shots or in control of the outcome rather than surrendering it all to Christ. And so James starts with the arrogance of thinking that we control our plans. The arrogance of thinking that we control our plans. He addresses this in verses 13 to 14 and again in verse 16. And he makes his point here by addressing the traveling merchants who were scattered among these ancient churches that James is writing to. In chapter 5, he's going to address the wealthy landowners who were exploiting the churches, almost certainly non-believers. Here, he seems to be speaking to believers who make their living by moving from city to city, doing business in different areas, and who, like so many in every age, have fallen prey to thinking that they are in charge. Those who say, today or tomorrow, we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Now, you look at that quote in verse 13, the quote that James puts into the mouths of these traveling merchants. And if you look at it, it doesn't naturally strike us as being that odd or off. I mean, it kind of seems like a pretty good idea to make a business plan and then go do it, right? Starting a business without serious planning, without counting the cost, is a great way to ruin your livelihood. This seems like good advice. If you're going to create a product and market it widely, but you don't plan ahead to make sure you have the supply chain in place, your business isn't going to last very long. Or if you've got dreams to get into med school and become a doctor one day, but you're always cutting biology class, you're not going to know what you need to know when that time comes. You have to think ahead. And so there's wisdom in planning ahead. And again, some of us love that. Some of us thrive at planning. We're like organizational ninjas. We've got everything charted out for the next several months. We've got 3, 5-year, 10-year projections of where I want to be someday. Others of us feel suffocated by that idea. Either because we just more prefer to go with the flow, or because we honestly don't know what we want to do next year or next week sometimes. We don't know or have direct ambitions of how to do this thing. And our world can put an incredible amount of pressure on young people to figure everything out you want to do in your life by the age of 15. It's kind of insane. Or the pressure we put on young business people to be innovative and more creative and organized than the next person. And again, planning's not bad. Ambition's not even a bad thing if it's done in a godly way. Those are good things. But let's be honest. Who among us can actually control the outcome of the plans that we make? Can any of us truly say, I planned this and I know without a doubt this is how it's going to go? Not a single one of us are able to do it. And that is what James is pushing against here. Not the planning, but the presumption in our planning. The arrogance to think that we can control our plans. Look at the rest of what he says in verses 13 to 14. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town, spend a year there, trade, make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Ouch. It's very similar to what to a parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 12. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, "What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." And he said, "I will do this." He came up with a plan. "I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.'" He had a plan. But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you've prepared, whose will they be?" The reality is that for all of our careful planning, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. Not a blessed one of us. Because James tells us here, our life, if you think in the grand scheme of things, some of us, our bodies tell us we've been around for a long time. I could feel that when I get up in the morning. But in the grand scheme of things, our life is a mist, a vapor that appears for a moment and then vanishes. If you were with us last winter and spring, you'll remember Ecclesiastes, right? Vapor of vapor, says the preacher. Everything is vapor. Your breath on a cold November morning, that's your span of days. And so if that's how quick our life comes and goes, and how insubstantial and temporary it is on the scale of eternity, who are we to think that we can control what tomorrow brings? Proverbs 27:1 tells us, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." How true is that? We don't know what a day may bring. And that was the problem with these traveling merchants that James writes to here, the ones that he's addressing. It's not their plans, but the presumption behind their plans. He spells it out in verse 16. "As it is, you boast in your arrogance, in your presumption. You boast of these plans as though you know things that you don't actually know, or can control things that you can't actually control." And this kind of boasting is not just like a slight misunderstanding, I got a little ahead of myself, or even an overzealous ambition. As James concludes in verse 16, all such boasting is evil. It's evil. That's the word he uses. It is an offense against God to tell him, here's how this is going to work. Because it's functionally putting ourselves in the place of God. That's what's at stake here. That's what James is warning against. Why is it so arrogant to think that we can control our plans? Why is it evil to manage our calendars so presumptuously? Because we're neglecting God's rightful authority and power and elevating ourselves in his place. That's the foolishness of presumption. So why do we do it? Why do we do it? Why is it so easy to presume that we can control either our schedules or the outcome of what we plan? Well, for some of us, it's because we've been told so our entire lives. Ever since we were little, we've had people telling us, you can be anything you want to be. Follow your heart. Chase your dreams. Your future is in your own hands. And we heard it often enough that we actually started to believe it. I am the master of my fate. And therefore God, his job, he's more like a supporting role, right? His job is to play the supporting role in my life to make me look good or feel good. So we think we're calling the shots. Or maybe what we do is we compartmentalize our lives. We divvy it up into different sections. And so we recognize God's in control of certain parts, the religious stuff. Going to church, praying before meals, giving charitably, that's God's arena. We will let him rule that. But why would he be interested in what I'm doing at school or at work or in my free time? I mean, that's my time. He's got his time, I have my time. And that mindset is so pervasive that it kind of seems weird to even call it into question. Why would I consult God with my business plans? Or my vacation plans? Or my daily to-do list? I mean, this is just stuff I have to do. What does it have to do with him? But that idea that we can either take God's place in planning and controlling our lives, or divide our lives up between sacred and secular, some bits that belong to God and other bits that are mine, some parts for him to rule over and some parts for me to rule over, not only is that wildly unbiblical, I mean, if you just think of Romans 12:1, for instance, how our whole lives are meant to be offered as an act of worship to God. Not only is it hopelessly naive, your life is a mist, you don't know how today's going to end, let alone tomorrow, but it is also dangerously arrogant. Who are we to think that we know better or can do better than God? Carrying on in life, in our work, in our recreation, our education, with no awareness or acknowledgement or surrender to God and his rightful rule over it all, is one more evidence of when worldliness creeps into the church, where we begin to think and act according to the categories of the world around us rather than as faithful members of God's kingdom. Who rules your planner? Who calls the shots on your calendar? Beware of the arrogance of thinking that we control our own plans. But in contrast to James's warning, he shows us an alternative. There's the warning against arrogantly thinking we're in charge. Then there's the alternative of a better way to go about your planning. And that's what he gives us in verse 15. The humility of submitting our plans to God. The humility of submitting our plans to God. Rather than boasting presumptuously about what we're going to do or what we're going to accomplish, James tells us in verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. And the key words there are, if the Lord wills. There's a recognition and a surrender to one who is over us in our planning. Humility, that's what we need. Chapter 4, verse 6 and verse 10 that we looked at last week called us to this humility. That's the humility we need to truly submit our plans to God, to humble ourselves before the Lord. And notice a couple of things about this alternative that James gives us here in verse 15. First, the difference between verses 13 and 14 and verse 15 is not the absence of plans. I know some of you are pulling for that. Like, let's just do away with planning altogether and my life would be happier. That's not where James goes. There's planning in verse 15. We will live and do this or that. So there's still planning involved. And so second, the real difference is whose will we're submitting those plans to, submitting our plans to God's will. The difference is the recognition that God is the one who rules our plans, and that whatever plans we make, he has the right to fulfill them or to readjust them or even to thwart them, according to his good pleasure and will. God gets veto power. God gets redirection authority. God gets the final say in our plans. That's hard. That's hard to actually embrace and admit. Submitting our plans to God. That feels really risky because it means I'm actually handing control over to somebody other than me. And I don't know how it's going to go. I can't predict or control the outcome. Especially hard after you work so diligently to make your plan. Like, I've got it all charted out here. Best way it could possibly go. It's hard to let go of that. And yet, when we step back and think about whose hands are we putting it into, like the only one who's actually wise enough and powerful enough and good enough to execute these plans for our good and for his glory. We're handing them to the one who actually knows what to do and has the goodness and power to do it. And so what then does that look like, practically speaking? If I'm going to truly surrender my plans to God, what does that look like? It's honestly quite simple. Two things. Apply God's wisdom to your planning and trust God with the results. Two things in submitting our plans to God. First, apply God's wisdom to your planning. Whether you are planning your weekend or your education or your career or building a business strategy or pursuing a significant other, whatever it is you're trying to discern and to do, apply God's wisdom to your planning. Now, that does not mean that there's a chapter and verse in the Bible for every decision that a human might have to make. Okay? Where are we going to eat dinner tonight? Well, let me do the holy flop. Close my eyes, open my Bible, and point. He said, take 2 of each creature onto the ark. It sounds like Old Country Buffet. That's what I'm thinking, right? It's not how it works, right? We don't just, nor does this mean that you have to scour the sky for signs or read the tea leaves or wait for some angelic messenger to show up before you make a decision. In fact, one of our classes right now at the 10 o'clock hour is all about this whole idea of wisdom and decision making. What does God want me to do? Rather, what we're talking about is applying God's wisdom to our plans. And that wisdom, of course, comes from the Scriptures. This is where God reveals himself and his vision for life to us. It comes from the Scriptures, both general principles and sometimes specific commands. But the Bible's not going to give you a specific business strategy. All right, I'm trying to build this business. What should I do? We'll look at this. But it is going to give you guardrails. It is going to give you some prohibitions. Don't sin in these ways when you build your business plan. It's going to give you some guardrails and principles for the methods you might use, integrity, righteousness. It's going to help direct your motivations. Why am I doing this? Who's this for? So the Bible instructs us, even if it's not like a chapter and verse sort of promise thing, we want to operate in accordance with God's revealed will. And that wisdom from the Scriptures also often comes to us through the counsel of fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord. So Proverbs 15:22, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. So as you're wrestling with whatever you're wrestling with, who in my life is walking with Jesus and could be a word of counsel to me to help me sort through this thing, looking to the wisdom of fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord. And of course, wisdom comes from prayer. Like, how do we get the wisdom of the Scripture and the wisdom of God's people? We need ultimately wisdom from God above, and that brings us to prayer, which is where James started clear back in chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. And think about that language of without reproach. God is not face-palming himself because you don't know the answer to what you're supposed to do in this moment. He doesn't answer and give you wisdom by chastising you. You shouldn't have even needed to ask that. He loves to give wisdom to his children when we ask. He's not waiting for us just to figure it out on our own, right? He gives wisdom to those who ask. And so ask. Think of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. We need his wisdom. In all your ways, acknowledge him, submit your plans to him, and he will make straight your paths. So apply God's wisdom to your planning. If you want to submit your plans to God's will, start by applying his wisdom. But the second component is critical, and that is to trust God with the results. So apply God's wisdom to your planning and trust God with the results. That might be the hardest part for most of us, right? I can get on board with the strategy of planning, but to truly surrender control, that's the hardest part. And again, it's only hard if we think more highly of ourselves than we ought to and less of God than we ought to. If we actually see God clearly and ourselves truly, we'd be eager to hand control over to him because we never had it in the first place and because he's the one who can carry it out. And he's the one who is truly calling the shots. Proverbs 16:1, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Or Proverbs 16:9, the heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. God is the one calling the shots. And so I want to look to him and his wisdom in making my plans, but I also need to leave the results of those plans in his hands. So how do I know if I'm doing that well? How do I know if I'm really, truly submitting my plans to the Lord? Is it like if my plan turns out and works, that meant I actually submitted it to the Lord? But if it doesn't go the way I thought, does that mean I somehow made a mistake or misread something along the way in making my plans? No, that's not at all how this works. The reality is, you may make the absolute best possible plan with all the right counsel, all the right scripture, and fervent prayer, and God may still do something different with it. He might. And so I think the only real test of whether we're truly submitting our plans to God's will, apart from applying his wisdom and making them, is how we respond when they don't go the way we want. That's how you're going to know, am I really submitting this to the Lord? Do I really trust his sovereign will, that he knows what is wise and best and good for us and his glory? Sometimes God's will takes our plans in unexpected directions. My plan when I graduated high school was to become an accountant. I went to college and studied accounting. I got a degree in accounting. And I had a pretty decent logic in choosing that direction. My dad was an accountant. There's a possibility of joining him in his practice. I was relatively good at it. The classes came pretty easy for me, pays decently. You put all of those together, they're all reasonable criteria for why someone might choose a particular career path. And yet here I am today, not an accountant. God's will took my life in an unexpected direction. And yet sometimes God's will takes our plans not simply in an unexpected direction, but in a very difficult direction, in a direction that ends up involving loss and pain and sorrow. It's one thing to end up with a different career than you planned. It's a different thing to end up losing your career overnight. Or we plan to raise a family. That's a good thing God gives for his people to do. And we're met with infertility instead. We plan to go to college. We get in. We get the grades, but there's no money to pay the tuition. There's so many times when our plans make really good sense. Like they look really godly and wise, and they still. Are we willing to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that? It can be hard when God's plan is not our plan. And friends, when that happens to someone we love, when God takes their plans in a difficult way that involves loss and sorrow, can we, in that moment, while we can recognize theologically God is still at work in this in ways we can't see or understand, but we can know that he's doing something to bring about his good, our good and his glory. We can recognize that theologically, but in that moment, can we avoid the theological lecture to the person who's suffering and simply weep with those who weep? Can we start there by lamenting first with those who are lamenting, and then walking with them to encourage them and care for them as they readjust to God's plan? And by his grace, even learn to see the good in it amid the pain. Can we start with lament before lecture, that we might care for one another wisely? Submitting our plans to God's will is not always easy. It is, in the long scheme of things, always right and good. It is always right and good. It's far better than boasting in our own self-deluded arrogance. And even when it's confusing or difficult or seemingly risky, it is always the right move to submit our plans to God. And that's the last thing that James reminds us in verse 17. The necessity of continuing to do what is good. Now you read verse 17 and it almost feels like a kind of a standalone verse, like James just dropped a proverb in at the end of the chapter. And we're not sure how it concludes his argument or what it's doing there. And it is somewhat of a general statement, but I think there's a couple of good reasons why James places it here. The first is to reiterate the gravity of submitting our plans to God. This is the right thing for us to do, to trust him with our planning. And now that his readers know that it is good and right to do, if they fail to do it, they're in sin. If they're going to continue on in their arrogant presumption, that's not just foolish, that's disobedient to God. So he's emphasizing the gravity of obedience here. But then second, I think this is a helpful reminder, because some of us, out of fear of presuming upon God's will, might be tempted, therefore, to do nothing at all. So I don't want to misread God's plans and make my own plans and then find out later that I didn't do it right and now I've accidentally sinned it, so I'm just not going to do anything. Our fear of presuming upon God causes us to just not do anything at all. If I don't know if it's God's will for me to go to this college or that college, I'm just not going to apply to any of them. That is not what James wants us to do in response to this correction. Fear of presuming upon God is not an excuse to do nothing or to leave undone things we know are right and good to do. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So trusting God with the results of our plans doesn't mean we stop planning, and it doesn't mean that we don't do the clear things that God has called us to in our daily lives, what is right and good and true. Planning, again, that's not the problem. Ambition, that's not even the problem. Presumption and arrogance, that's the problem. And if we're not careful, cowardice can come in right alongside them. I don't want to mess up, so I'm not even going to try. That is not the right response. If we use a fear of messing up as an excuse not to do the things God has clearly called us to do, that's not going to fly. We need to submit our plans to the will of God while continuing to do good. Don't just put the car in park and sit there. Keep it in drive. Keep doing what God calls you to do and trust him to give you the clarity you need as you go. Submit your plans to the will of God while continuing to do good. That is James's call to us. And that is truly an act of faith, to trust him, to look at his word and his wisdom in making our plans and to trust him with the results of those plans, even when we can't understand what he's doing, even when we don't we don't have a category for what comes about. We have to believe, we truly have to believe that God is sovereign and good, that he is powerful and wise. And as we come to the Lord's table this morning, what an incredible reminder he's given us of his goodness and his sovereignty, of his wisdom and his power, even when things didn't make sense to us.